Hello everybody, thank you for coming to another story time today. Today, June 1st, is World Reef Awareness Day, and all of the month of June is actually World Oceans Month, and next week on June 8th is World Oceans Day. So oceans are a big topic in the environmental world during the month of June, and we're going to kick it off today by talking about corals. So I don't want to talk for too long because we have a longer story today with a bunch of really great details in it, especially at the end of the story. They'll give you some more information. But before we begin, what is a coral, right? So a coral, a lot of people think maybe they are rocks because a lot of them are hard like rocks, but corals are actually living animals, and they are tiny, squishy invertebrates, so that means they don't have a backbone. They're very, very small, and each individual organism is called a polyp, but they live together in these big communities of identical organisms like clones, and this big colony as a whole is called a coral. Sometimes we have hard corals, which secrete a substance called calcium carbonate that make that hard structure to the corals that we think kind of feels like a rock. And if you think about it, a lot of other animals actually do this too. Like a snail, for example, has a calcium carbonate shell. So that's pretty common in the animal world, to secrete something hard to protect yourself, right? There are also soft corals, like those big fan corals that you might see waving in the ocean, that don't have those hard parts. But when we get a bunch of different hard corals together, they form a coral reef. So our story today is going to be about coral reefs because they are a super important part of the world and provide a great habitat for about 1/4 of all the species living in the ocean. And scientists estimate that that could be up to 1.8 million species. So 1/4 of those depend on coral reefs for some part of their life cycle. So they're really important for habitat. They're really important in protecting our coastline, right? They kind of break up waves and some of that energy in the ocean before it comes ashore. And they are also really important for biodiversity, for hunting, for gathering. We gather a lot of our food from the coral reef, so we have to be careful that we don't take too much food or too many fish species from our reefs. So our story today is called The Brilliant Deep, Rebuilding the World's Coral Reefs. And it was written by Kate Messner. You might be familiar with that name because we've read some of her other books at Storytime. She's one of my favorite authors for kids. And it was illustrated by Matthew Forsyth. So let's find out what's going on with our coral. The Brilliant Deep, Rebuilding the World's Coral Reefs. The story of Ken Neddemeyer and the Coral Restoration Foundation. I love the illustrations in this book. It starts with one. One night, after a full moon, the corals begin to spawn, releasing first one, then millions of tiny lives, until the waters swirl like a snow globe. Some become food for hungry fish. Some are washed into the deep sea. Some drift in the currents until they come to rest, not too deep, on the ocean floor. If one is lucky, it lands in a place where it can grow. This one will begin a coral reef. Ken Neddemeyer grew up near Florida's Kennedy Space Center, watching America race toward the moon. Before men took off in rockets, Ken's father worked at NASA as an engineer. Ken watched his father's team send unmanned rockets, Little Joe, Redstone, Atlas, toward the stars. Men followed, Alan Shepard, John Glenn. It seemed like just about anything might be possible if you set your mind to it. But Ken's dreams weren't in the stars. He loved, what do you think he loved? The ocean. he watched TV shows about underwater explorer Jacques Cousteau. He visited the beach whenever he could, swimming far out to a world of angelfish and sea stars. The reefs of the Florida Keys teemed with life. They painted the ocean floor fire red and murky gold. How could the reefs grow so large? What made all the different colors and shapes? How could such tiny creatures build such elaborate homes of rock? Ken learned to scuba dive and began collecting fish to keep and study at home. At one point, he had 30 aquariums in his bedroom, all bursting with life. That'd be a lot to take care of. Ken's favorite place was always out on the reef, until things began to change. One summer, hotter than the rest, Ken noticed the corals were losing their color, and there weren't as many fish. This coral all looks pretty dead, huh? It's not colorful anymore. We don't see lots of fish around it. The sea urchins had started to die. They are the gardeners of the reef, tiny groundskeepers who control the algae. But Ken didn't know that at the time. Even scientists didn't understand what an important role the sea urchin played until they were gone. Ken watched his favorite place in the world begin to fade away. The reefs were dying, and it seemed like there was nothing he could do to save them. What do you think? What could he do to save them? But one day, that changed. Ken was all grown up, operating a live rock farm in the Florida Keys. Live rocks aren't really alive. They're rocks covered with algae, mollusks, sponges, and other invertebrates. So an invertebrate is something without a backbone. They're used in saltwater aquariums as decoration and to filter waste from the water, turning poisons like ammonia and nitrates into harmless compounds. This makes the water safer and healthier for everything that lives in it. And growing them is really just a matter of patience. Placing rows of bare rocks on the ocean floor and waiting for the marine life to move in. On one moonlit night, a nearby coral colony spawned, and a few of those delicate lives found their way to Ken's rocks. They grew into Staghorn Corals. Staghorn Corals are protected, illegal to take from the ocean floor. But the law says if a coral colony grows on a live rock farm, the owner can keep it. How do you think Ken's going to use these corals that are now on his live rock farm? Ken could have sold the specimens to someone with a saltwater aquarium, but instead, he and his daughter had an idea. As the corals grew, they cut off pieces and attached those pieces to other rocks. They discovered they could use those first colonies to grow more and more corals. What would happen if someone grew a coral colony and then tried to plant it on a dying reef? Would it grow? Could that colony help rebuild the reefs Ken loved? Could a reef come back to life? Ken made plans to go to the reef where he'd loved diving as a kid to find out. He selected his coral colonies. He loaded his scuba gear and supplies and set out for the reef. One hopeful dive. One optimistic experiment. 6 small coral colonies, each one the size of a hand with the fingers stretched out, glued onto a limestone surface where the reef had once flourished and was now bleached barren. Would they grow? Ken and his friends came back to check on the coral colonies again and again. Each month they had grown larger. It was too soon to say if the reef would fully recover, if the fish would return. But it was a beginning. Ken started a group called the Coral Restoration Foundation, a small army of volunteers on a mission to restore the reefs. They hang bits of coral on special underwater trees and line where the corals can grow. When the corals are large enough, these farm-raised colonies are loaded onto boats with volunteers, dive equipment, and tools. Then it's out to a new home, one the corals will help build. Volunteers take great care with this homecoming. They search for just the right spot, a place where each coral colony can hold on once it's grown enough to attach to the reef on its own. Divers scrape off any algae. They use chipping hammers, scraping and banging to get the surface even and smooth. Then, with a careful dab of epoxy, just the size of a Hershey's Kiss, volunteers attach the coral colonies, piece by piece, arm by arm, hoping they will grow on their own. So it's like they glue the corals down to these rocks, and then eventually, hopefully, the corals will start growing on their own and hold on to the rocks. Today, the transplants are not only surviving, but also reproducing. Ken's group has planted tens of thousands of coral colonies on the reefs in the Florida Keys. And now he's working with other countries, teaching people how to grow corals of their own to save the reefs that they love. We see fish returning, the colors are returning, they look healthy again, right? Tonight, the moon will be full and bright, the corals may spawn, and if one tiny life lands in just the right spot, another new colony will grow, and then another, and another, and another. It starts with one. What happened to the coral reefs? There's no question that the world's coral reefs are dying at an alarming rate. Today, there is less than half as much coral cover in the Caribbean as there was in the 1970s. On some reefs, just a small fraction of the corals remain alive. The reasons are complicated. Scientists believe that changing ocean temperatures, disease, boating, and overfishing have all contributed to the problem. Ken and his team are part of the solution, especially as their ideas and techniques spread to other countries. Other scientists think protecting parrotfish and sea urchins might help save the reefs, since these animals eat the algae that can overwhelm corals if it's not kept in check. There's also hope that corals might be bred to withstand higher ocean temperatures in the future. That's pretty cool. So it says one of the ways we can help is to support one of these coral programs, but I will put some resources and activities for you in the link below related to coral for this week. And this just has a few different terms that maybe were mentioned in the book, so I'll read through these just in case some of the terms in the book were a little confusing. It says corals are marine invertebrates that usually live in colonies made up of identical individual organisms known as polyps. So these tiny little polyps make up one big coral, so it's a whole community of organisms. Exoskeleton, a hard external skeleton that covers the body of some invertebrates. Coral polyps secrete a substance called calcium carbonate, which forms exoskeletons. Okay, so lots of other animals do this too, right? If you think about like a clam makes a hard shell, or a snail, hard shells that will protect them. Polyp, a single coral organism. Polyp, a single coral organism within a colony. A coral reef is a community of living creatures living on and around a rocky undersea formation created by the exoskeletons of corals. Gametes, egg and sperm cells released when corals spawn. So it mentioned spawning in the book, right? When these combine, they form embryos which develop into larvae and under the right conditions grow into new coral colonies. So that's how corals reproduce or make new corals. So those would be little coral babies. Spawn, the synchronized release of millions of gametes from the coral polyps of the same species. So those are some of the terms that we heard in the book. And here's a picture of Ken in real life. So this was a real person who started this foundation and has done a ton of work to save corals around the planet. So this June, as we celebrate World Ocean Day, we can think about what we can do to help the oceans and help the corals. And again, I'll put some resources in a link down below. But think about what kind of impact you have at home on the ocean. Even if you live super far away from an ocean, things we do still have an impact, right? So making sure all of our litter goes in the garbage so it doesn't end up in the ocean is one thing we can do. Reducing our carbon footprint is another thing we can do, right? And that I could talk for 20 more minutes on that, so I won't. But things like shutting off your lights, reducing your electricity, reducing how many new things you need, right? Trying to save things, use old things, reuse things, recycle them. All those things help in the fight against climate change, which is something that's really affecting our oceans. So resources and activities down below. We'll see you for another story time in 2 more weeks. Until then, have fun out in nature. Bye-bye.